program, it's Exodus chapter 9, and those are the verses 13b through 16. This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so they may worship me. For this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Previously spoke about the plagues of Egypt and the devastation that occurred. But the verse I just read declares the purpose. The purpose was to demonstrate God's power, that there was none on earth like him, and that everything was under his authority. What took place in Egypt back then was a spiritual confrontation. The Bible's full of them. Spiritual confrontations between those who worship God and those who worship other spiritual beings. That conflict began when Lucifer rebelled against God in heaven. That battle still continues in the spiritual realm. But ever since the Garden of Eden, those spiritual skirmishes have also taken place here on earth. These spiritual beings that were cast out of heaven during the original rebellion have set up, and over the course of time there's been shifts in their power and authority, but they have set themselves up as rulers over nations, over kingdoms, over regions on the earth. They're recognized for having authority and power, although it's limited. This spiritual battle that's been taking place, although it's spiritual in nature, it manifests itself at times in the physical realm. Although these skirmishes are manifest in the physical realm, the majority of the battles go on in the minds of people. What it really is a clash of ideologies, a clash of thoughts and beliefs. Beliefs that have taken root, established strongholds in the minds of people, and it both influences and controls what they think. Well, that's what happened when Moses showed up in Egypt and declared to the Pharaoh that God had said, "Let my people go." He declared that God wanted Pharaoh to release the Israelites that had now been enslaved in the nation of in the nation of Egypt. But Pharaoh had no respect for this God, and he had no respect for this people that a previous Pharaoh had highly respected. Remember Joseph raising him up to be number 2 in the kingdom, invited all the Israelites to come and live in his kingdom and set up a special place for them. They were once respected, and so was God. But this Pharaoh had no respect at all, and it had enslaved the people. He had his own gods that he worshipped. He didn't care about the God of the Israelites. He believed that they were the source of all the power of Egypt. So the first encounter in this ideological clash was when Aaron threw down his rod in front of Pharaoh and it turned into a serpent. And the priests of the gods of Egypt did the same thing. They threw down their rods. They turned into serpents. But then Aaron's snake ate all of theirs. It was the first demonstration of God's power and authority being greater than the gods of Egypt. But Pharaoh wasn't impressed. He didn't care. But that spiritual confrontation had just begun. Nowadays we use the phrase, a throwdown. You know where it comes from? Aaron threw down his rod. It's the beginning of a confrontation. In the nations of Europe decades ago, they would have duels. And you'd slap the other guy in the face with the glove and challenge him to a duel. It was a battle over ideas, over thoughts, over things said. These kind of skirmishes have taken place. But like I said earlier, a lot of these ideological skirmishes are really spiritual in nature. They're motivated by spirit. There's always been conflict on the earth since the Garden of Eden between those who worship God and those who worship other gods. Well, I spoke about the 10 plagues, and I tried to get you to visualize and maybe even sense the stench of what was going on, all the different things. And I did that last week, but what I want to do this week is go into each of those 10 plagues and not only point out what they were, but which Egyptian gods got disgraced by them. And a lesson to learn from each of these plagues. So let's start with the first one. First plague was that the water was turned to blood and all the fish died. The Egyptian priests called on their gods, and they duplicated and made more bloody water and more fish die, but they couldn't solve the problem. There's an Egyptian goddess, one in charge of fish and water. Mat-Hamit was her name. Then there was Sobek, the god of the Nile, and Hapi, the god of fertility and the source of life, which the overflowing of the Nile always fertilized the fields. They could not solve this problem. But they were the gods that the Egyptians worshipped that were in charge of those things. What was the lesson, the very first lesson? God is the true source of life. The fresh water, the fish living in it, all that dwells in the waters. It's recorded in Genesis. But the Egyptians believed in their false god. The second plague. Frogs come out of the water. They leave the water. And they're everywhere. In their houses, in their pantries, in the ovens, everywhere. Well, once again, the priests call on their gods, and they duplicate it. They get more frogs to come out. Now go back. Their goddess of fertility and water and renewal was called Heket. She was symbolized with a frog head. This was a direct confrontation against her. Couldn't fix the problem. So what's the lesson here? That nature obeys God, even causing them to leave their habitat to do his will. The priests couldn't get the frogs to leave. Moses asked Pharaoh to ask God to do it, and God did it. And they went back to the river. The rest of them just died right where they were. It was part of some of the stench. Plague 3. The dust of the earth turned into biting lice. At this point, the priests of Egypt said, none of our gods can do this. This is definitely the hand of God. There's nothing we can do about this. They had a god over the dust of the earth. His name was Geb. He ruled over the dust of the earth, but had no power to undo or even to duplicate. Bring life out of the dirt. Remember where man came from? From the dust of the earth? God did that, not Geb. Lesson 3. Other gods, those spiritual beings that were cast out of heaven, the ones other people worship as gods, only have limited power, only have limited ability. Then there's plague number 4. Flies are everywhere, except where the Israelites lived. This is the first of the plagues that makes a distinction between what's happening everywhere and what's happening only to those who don't obey God. Well, they had a fly-headed god named Khepri, god of creation, involved in the movement of the sun and rebirth. In the days where evolution was beginning to be taught in the United States and in England and other parts of the world, do you remember ever being taught about spontaneous generation and they thought that flies just appeared? They didn't know about the larva, they didn't know about all the bacteria, they didn't know all about all that stuff, and they thought that there was spontaneous generation, that life would just come out of nowhere. Not that God created the heavens and the earth and all that are in it. Well, they had a god, Khepri, who was their god of creation, and his head was a fly. I wonder why. Probably because they thought the same kind of thing. Look, you got meat, you got garbage, all of a sudden, there's flies, larvae. I don't have that confirmed, but why else would you put a fly head on a god and call him the God of creation? Lesson 4. Those who love God and serve him are under his protection. Only the Israelites were protected from the flies. The rotting stench was going on. The fish were dead. The water was putrid for a week. The lice were there. All this stuff was going on. And yet, and the frogs died and were rotting, but no flies where the Israelites lived. First time Pharaoh got to see a distinction. But he didn't really learn the lesson. Because next came plague 5. A disease, a pestilence in all the animals out in the field. All the work animals, all the food livestock got sick and died. Well, the Egyptians had gods and goddesses that were supposed to protect these things. Hathor, goddess of love and protection, who was depicted with the head of a cow. Shed, the god of protection against disease, obviously couldn't stop this. Resheph, a god of plague and destruction and disease. Dedun, the god of wealth, all the abundance and the wealth of the livestock and of the kingdom was there, had no power to stop this. And all the animals out in the field died. What's the lesson? God is the source of all your sustenance. God is the source of all your security. God is the source of all your health. Plague 6. They took the ashes and they threw them up into the air. And all the people and the animals were infected with pus-filled sores. The priests were so consumed by this on their bodies also that they're now considered unclean. Not only can they not go and stand in front of Pharaoh because they're diseased, but they can't even go into the temples of their own gods because they're unclean. They had a god of the air named Shu, who now is disgraced because Shu didn't stop the disease coming down from the air and infecting all the men and the animals, all the people. The lesson sort of continues on from the previous one, that your health depends on God. Then there's plague 7. A hailstorm with fire. Moses warns them that all the people and all the animals should not be kept outside, because the next day there's going to be this hailstorm with fire like you've never seen before. Well, at this point, some of the Egyptians decide they're going to believe Moses and trust what he says, and they stay inside and they keep their animals inside. And others don't believe him, and they send everybody out into the fields like they normally do, and they die in the storm. But not only the people and the animals, but the storm also destroys all the flax and the barley that was growing. It was ripening in the fields, the Bible says. That's giving you a reference to the time of year. Well, flax and barley are not really necessarily food staples in the Egyptian culture. It was for clothing, and it was for beer, beverages, the barley. It gets destroyed. But also destroyed, not the main food supply, these particular crops, but the trees are broken. Now think about all the potential lost for the fruit and the oils and all the other things, the seeds. All of this is destroyed. They had a goddess of destruction, Sekhmet. They had a goddess of the sky, Nut. They had no ability to stop this from happening. They were supposed to have control over the sky and storms, destruction. They couldn't do a thing. What's the lesson? There's safety for those who obey God. I mentioned it once before. There are the things God has told us to do. You stay within these guidelines and you're safe. You step outside and it's not God that whacks you, it's when the adversary can get to you. You stay within the safety of what God has said to do and you're protected. Some of the Egyptians learned that lesson before that plague. Others did not. Then came the next plague, the locusts. This time, all vegetation, even the food that was in storage, is devastated by the locusts. Nut, that sky goddess, Seth, the god of storms and disorder, again are disgraced and powerless. Each of these plagues is a direct affront to gods of Egypt. The lesson learned here is that your sustenance, even your storage, your supplies, your sustenance comes from God. He provides not only the food for the whole world, but all the essential needs to make that come to pass. You can't survive without him. But Pharaoh was still refusing to obey. So then came plague 9. Complete darkness for 3 days. It said the darkness was so heavy it could be felt. It was day and night. Well, one of the major gods of Egypt was Amun-Ra, the sun god. His son, Horus, the sky god. Khonsu and Ea were moon gods. There's no light for 3 days, day or night. No power to bring light from these gods. They couldn't undo what God said would happen. The absence of light represents death and hopelessness. You're in the dark. It also perhaps reminded them of 2 of their very ancient gods, Kek and Koket. They were gods of the darkness before the sun ever shone. The Bible talks about before God created the sun, that darkness was upon the face of the deep. They had names for the gods that controlled the darkness back then. This is what they were brought back to, a place of darkness with no sunlight, no nightlight. All the nightlight really is the reflection of the sun from around the planet. Without the sun, you're in the dark. You want to guess what animal representation was for these two ancient gods of darkness? Frogs. The lesson for Plague 9 is that God gives light to those who love him. There was sunlight where the Israelites lived, but not where the Egyptians were. Those who reject God live in darkness. Everything we do depends on him, the giver of light, the giver of life. Well, at this point you would think that Pharaoh would see that his gods are hopeless, helpless. He sees that God responds to Moses' request to end each of these plagues, but he still won't comply. He stubbornly refuses, and that's what brings on the 10th plague. The 10th plague was the death of all the firstborn of people and of animals. They had a god named Mut, M-U-T. Mut was a goddess responsible for the protection of the soul. She had no power to protect any of them. They all died. What's the lesson from Plague 10? Repeated willful disobedience toward the giver of life deserves death. But you can be saved by the sacrifice. The Israelites were told to sacrifice a lamb. We today call it Passover. And the blood of the lamb was shed. The sacrifice, the payment made for sin. And they were saved from that death. Today, that sacrifice that we rely on is not that of a lamb, but that of the life of Jesus Christ. Many people today still worship these, these other gods of the Bible, these other spiritual beings. Spiritual confrontations still take place. But most people view the world solely from a physical realm perspective. And so they don't recognize these skirmishes as being spiritual in nature. They only see it as the evening news. But this stuff goes on every day, all around the planet. Conflicts of ideology, conflicts of power. It's all spiritual in nature. If you can look at it that way, if you can perceive it that way, you'll have a greater understanding of what's going on. Because we are caught in the crossfire of a battle that's going on between God and the adversary. And the question is, which side are you on, or have you not chosen yet? Let me read you two scriptures. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 and 4. It says, "For though we live in the world, we are not carrying on a worldly war. For the weapons of our warfare are not worldly, but have divine power to destroy strongholds." And those strongholds, those fortresses, are in the minds of individuals. And then there's Ephesians 6:12 that says, "We are not contending against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in their heavenly places." That's what's going on. There are so many spiritual skirmishes, confrontations, duels, whatever you want to call them, recorded in the Bible. Some are major, like what happened to Egypt. Others are just between two individuals. The same is going on today. Whether it's nations, individuals, it's still spiritual in nature. Have you ever talked to someone and all you're doing is expressing your opinion and suddenly they're outraged and just riled up? That's a stronghold feeling like it's being attacked simply by a thought being introduced. These are the kind of things that really annoyed Pharaoh, that someone would actually walk in and say, my God said you should let us go. And the confrontation began. It didn't end well for Pharaoh and the people that obeyed him and continued, despite all the potential lessons to be learned, continued to reject God. There are plenty of instances with other kings of other nations that had confrontations. We've talked about some of them before: Nebuchadnezzar, Saul, and others in Persia. And they have turned to God and recognized his power and authority. And all goes well. But then the leadership changes. It's an individual choice always. And the power and influence of an individual determines the power and influence of the truth versus error. This conflict will continue until Jesus Christ returns. So don't be alarmed. Don't be concerned. Pray. Because the world is in God's hands. Have no fear. Trust in him. Let's sing a song.